All right, Emmanuel.
All right. Can everyone see the screen right there? Can you see it? All right. Good evening, everyone. I'm glad and excited to see those that could join us for another evening. I'm excited to share and continue the story we've been going over. This is going to be a really good one, a really interesting one. And so the title of this message is called Rising Above the Jealous Eye. I think we've all experienced jealousy at one point in our lives. And I think we've all seen someone be jealous of someone else. It's as simple as going to a kid's birthday party, right? And it's finally time to open the presents. And all the kids gather, excited to see what the birthday boy or girl is about to open. And as the birthday child opens their gifts, they open something really big and fantastic. And then there's always that boy or girl who starts to point and look back at their parents and say, I want that, I want that. And they start to sometimes even cry and say, why don't I get that present? I wish I could have that, right? And unfortunately, that jealousy doesn't just stay in childhood. It follows us through our teenage years and even into adulthood. Now, social media has made it very easy for us to be jealous or feel feelings of envy towards others. You're scrolling in your phone and you're like, whoa, I can't believe they got another car. And you look at outside and you see your used beat up car in the driveway and you scroll down some more and you see, wow, they're going to Disneyland again. Man, I wish I could go to Disneyland. It's been some years. And you continue to scroll and you see these perfect pictures of someone who looks so happy in their relationship or their marriage. And you wish, I wish I was in a relationship like that. And so the feelings of jealousy is something that is normal and part of being a human being. Feeling jealous or envious isn't necessarily sinful. What becomes the issue, though, is the actions that you take when you're feeling that jealousy. When it is you're feeling that envy in your heart, what it is you do can cause you to sin against God. And today's story, we'll get to see how King Saul became jealous of David and what actions he did towards David where he ultimately sins against God. So let's go ahead and read it together. You can find this in the next chapter, which is 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 5 through 30. For those that weren't here last week, or if you got to see last week's video, you'll remember David's on top of the world. He just defeated the giant Goliath. Everyone was afraid and he was victorious over him. He has cut off the head of the giant and he's shown it to King Saul in victory. And he is doing well. And so King Saul tells David, I want you to now come home, come live with me at the palace. And that's exactly what David does. He moves into the palace. He's living there with King Saul. He becomes best friends with Jonathan, which is King Saul's son. And we'll go over a little bit more about how close they were as friends in next week's story. And that's where we're going to pick up right now. So verse 5 tells us here, whatever King Saul would ask David to do, David did it successfully. And let me see if I can move you guys a little bit so I can see my screen. It says, so Saul made him a commander over the men of war, an appointment that was welcomed by the people and Saul's officers alike. Verse 6 tells us that when the victorious Israelite army was returning home after David had killed the Philistine, women from all the towns of Israel gathered together to meet King Saul, and he started to sing and dance for joy with tambourines and cymbals. And this was the song they were singing. The girls and the women there were singing, Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. When Saul heard this, it made him very angry. He said, what's this? He said, they credit David with 10,000s and yet me with only thousands? Next, they'll be making him their king. Verse 9 tells us that from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. Another verse in the Bible, another version tells us that it was a close eye on David. Verse 10, we continue. The very next day, there was a tormenting evil spirit that was from God that came upon Saul. It overwhelmed him. And basically, Saul became possessed. And when he was in this state of mind, he began to rave in the palace like a madman. And David is just sitting there playing the harp like he did each and every day. And Saul, as he's raving, he was probably mumbling gibberish. He was probably even screaming. He has a spear in his hand. And with no provocation whatsoever, he suddenly gets the spear and he hurls it at David, intending to pin him to the wall. But David was able to escape him twice. So let's pause right there. Let's take a step back. My question to you is, does King Saul's action when he hurled that spear at David, did it seem intentional to you, or was it unintentional? Another question I'd like you to think about, did King Saul actually know and understand what he was doing? What was King Saul's state of mind at the moment he threw that spear at David? So let's think about it this way. If King Saul was going to be on trial for attempted murder of David, if the prosecution, I can imagine, would argue this, they would say that Saul intended to kill David because he threw the spear at him not once, but twice. How do we know he threw it twice? Because it tells us here that David escaped him twice. If I was arguing the case in favor for Saul as the defense attorney, you would argue that it wasn't intentional necessarily, because he couldn't form that intent, because we know from what we read that Saul was overwhelmed by a tormenting evil spirit. Essentially, he was possessed at the time that he did it, right? We know here that he was being tormented to the point where he was raving in the house like a madman. And if I was the defense attorney on the case, I say there's witnesses in the palace that can come and testify and say that Saul was running around like a crazy guy. He wasn't making sense. He was speaking gibberish. And it was at that point that he threw the spear. But the hard part would be to say, well, then why, when he missed him, did he grab it and try to kill him again? If in fact he didn't know what he was doing. At the end of the day, it would probably be a close one. It'd be up to the jury to decide. But as we continue in the story, we will see that Saul's true intentions towards David will become more clear later in the story. So let's continue on with the story. Verse 12 tells us that Saul was then very afraid of David. Why? For the Lord was with David, but had turned away from Saul. So the Lord was with David, but he had turned away from Saul. And he knew this. Saul probably felt it in his heart. Verse 13 tells us then Saul decides to send him away, and he appoints him as a commander over 1,000 men. And so now David is the commander, one of the commanders in the army, and he's got 1,000 men under him. And now he has to go and lead them into battle. And it tells us that David faithfully led his troops into battle. Verse 14 says, and yet David continued to succeed in everything that he did, for the Lord was with him. Verse 16 says, and all Israel and Judah loved David because he was so successful at leading his troops into battle. And then verse 15 says, when Saul recognized this, he became even more afraid of him. Verse 17, one day, King Saul said to David, hey, David, you know what? I'm ready to give you my older daughter, Merab, as your wife. But first, you got to prove yourself to be truly a real warrior by fighting the Lord's battles. For Saul thought to himself, you know what? I'll send him out against the Philistines, and then I'll let them kill him rather than doing it myself. Verse 18, David not even knowing anything, he says, wow, who am I? And what is my family in Israel that I should be the king's son-in-law? David exclaimed, my father's family is nothing. And by that he meant they didn't come from like a prestigious family. They weren't rich. They weren't a noble family in Israel. And so that shows us something about David's heart. It shows us that David was a humble person. It shows us that David wasn't even about bragging about the fact that he had recently killed Goliath. Someone else probably would have been like, of course I'm going to marry your daughter. Wasn't that part of the reward? He wasn't even claiming King Saul's daughter as a reward for already defeating the giant, when that was what we learned last week. There was, in fact, no sense of entitlement at all from David. Verse 19 tells us, but this is crazy. When the time came for Saul to give his daughter Merab in marriage to David, look what King Saul does. He gave her instead away to another guy named Adriel, a man from Meloa. Man, I'm sure David was very disappointed. But verse 20 tells us that in the meantime, while all that was happening, Saul's other daughter, her name was Michal, had fallen in love with David. And Saul, when he heard this, was delighted when he heard about it. But here's why. He says to himself in verse 21, here's another chance to see him killed by the Philistines. So Saul said to himself, but then when he talked to David, he said, hey, David, today you have a second chance to become my son-in-law. Verse 22 says, then Saul told his men, he gathered all his men. He says, hey, I want you to go talk to David. Here's what I want you to tell him. Tell David that the king really likes you. And so do we. Why don't you accept the king's offer and become his son-in-law? Verse 23, when Saul's men said these things to David, he replied, okay, but how can a poor man such as myself from a humble family afford the bride price for the daughter of a king? You see, back then when people were going to get married, it was tradition that the groom had to go to the bride's family and he had to present some type of gift to her family in exchange to have the privilege or the opportunity to marry her. And so David's saying, I come from a poor family. There's no way I'd be able to give a gift that would be deserving to be able to marry the princess. Verse 24 shows us what Saul tells David. When Saul's men reported this back to the king, he told them, all right, here's what I want you to tell David. Tell David that all that I want for the bride price is 100 Philistine foreskins. Vengeance on my enemies is really all I want. But what Saul had in mind was that David would be killed in the fight. Verse 26, David was delighted to accept the offer. We see here that David didn't stop being humble, even though he was taken advantage of in that first situation when he was supposed to marry the first daughter, and instead she was given away to another guy. We see that David didn't get angry with Saul or even with God. Instead, what David did was he just waited, and God blessed him with another opportunity. And we see here that in fact God was with David, because before the time limit expired, verse 27 says he and his men went out and they killed 200 Philistines. Then David was able to fulfill the king's requirement by presenting all their foreskins to him. So Saul gave his daughter Michal to David to be his wife. But the story doesn't end there. We continue. Verse 28. When Saul realized that the Lord was with David and how much his daughter Michal actually really loved him, Saul became even more afraid of him. And so he remained David's enemy for the rest of his life. Verse 30 says that every time the commanders of the Philistines attacked, David was more successful against them than all the rest of Saul's officers in the army. And so as a result, David's name became very famous. So that ends the reading part for this evening, but now we go into the discussion part. And I want to break some things down here and point out some themes and some issues with jealousy. So we start off with this question. How did King Saul's jealousy of David even start to begin with? Do you remember? Saul's jealousy of David started when the women came out and they were singing and cheering about David's success in battle. To refresh your memory, verse 8 tells us that when he heard all the cheering and singing, it made Saul very angry. And that's when he asked himself, what is this? He said, how could they credit David with 10,000s, killing 10,000 soldiers and enemies, and me with only a couple thousand? Next, they're going to be making him their king. And so we see that from that time on, that's when Saul started to keep a jealous eye on David. So here, it's clear that Saul was envious and jealous of what? Of David's success. We also see that Saul had confidence issues with himself. He was the type of person that was insecure with himself, because we see that when he says, well, look, now they're going to try to make him their king. He felt threatened by David's success to the point where he thought, maybe he's going to be the next king and take my place. And he didn't like that. And we see finally that although David did nothing wrong to Saul, Saul still tried to hurt him. And to remind you, we read that Saul had that spear in his hand. David's over there playing the harp, minding his own business, playing like he always does, and didn't provoke Saul in any way. And yet Saul grabs that spear and he tries to pin him to the wall with it. And yet God was with David, protected him, and he was able to escape him 2 times. So the question I have for those that are here listening and for those that will be watching this video is this: who's the King Saul in your life? Who's that person that is jealous and envious of your life? Who's jealous of your relationships? Who's jealous of your success? Ask yourself, does that person have confidence issues? Are they someone who are insecure, and that's why they're feeling such envious and jealous feelings towards you? Have they hurt you or tried to hurt you, even though you never did anything wrong to them? Or have they tried to get you in trouble at work or at school, or maybe even set you up for failure? You see, King Saul tried to set up David for failure. Remember in verse 13, it says that Saul sent him away and appointed him commander over 1,000 men. Now, 1,000 men sounds like a lot, and I'm not too sure if that was a lot or a little bit in those days, but it's possible that it wasn't a lot. And that when Saul sent him away with 1,000 men, it's possible that David had to fight battles where he was outnumbered 3-1. That means he probably fought battles where he had to fight against 3,000 enemies, and yet God was always with him, and David was successful every time. We see here that yet David succeeds in every battle because why? The Lord was with him. We see from what we read that David faithfully led his troops into battle. And verse 14 tells us that David continued to succeed in everything he did. Why? Because he was the best? No, because the Lord was with David. And yet we see here King Saul, that rather than being happy for David's success, arguably it's King Saul's success too, because David is fighting all of King Saul's enemies for him. Instead of being happy for that success, King Saul becomes more jealous and more intentional about hurting David. And so the jealous eye that we mentioned just keeps getting bigger and bigger. And we see this example of King Saul doing that when he sets up this plan to give away his older daughter to David in marriage. That plan was really just meant to cover up his actual plan, which was setting up David to get killed. And we see here a quote from what we read that for Saul thought, I'll send him against the Philistines and then let them kill him rather than me doing it myself. And so now we see that King Saul's actual state of mind at this point is very clear. Whereas before, when he threw that spear, we weren't sure. We said it was kind of close and he had like the evil spirit in him and we weren't too sure. There's no evil spirit overwhelming him at this point. He's completely conscious and free and knows exactly what he's doing. There's no more reasonable doubt, is what I would argue here. Saul wanted David dead. And David didn't do anything to him. He didn't hurt him in any way. He didn't do anything to deserve Saul's hate and jealousy and envy towards him. And yet there are people like that in your life that you're having to deal with or that you've dealt with, where you didn't do anything to them. You didn't do absolutely nothing wrong. And yet they're jealous and they're envious about your situation and they're trying to hurt you or they have hurt you in some way. And again, if you had any doubts for whatever reason that Saul's true intentions were to hurt David, then consider the fact that Saul tries to get David killed how many times? 2 times by the Philistines. When first with that first daughter, and then he gets, oh, well, my other daughter loves you too. Would you like to marry her? And he tries to set him up to get killed there too. And his plan just doesn't work. And so that's where I had there the quote, which is that when he heard that his daughter Michal had fallen in love with David, Saul is happy to himself, not because he wants to give his daughter away, because now he believes he has another chance to see David get killed by the Philistines. And I want to point out something there. Notice the two-faced King Saul here, right? Often, let me point that out here on verse 21. Here's where we see King Saul being a two-faced person. So in his mind, he thinks, here's another chance to get David killed by the Philistines. He says that to himself. But to David, he says, hey, David, guess what? You have a second chance to become my son-in-law. You could be part of the family. He's being two-faced. And I want you to look at that because you know what? Often the jealous people in your life are in fact two-faced with you as well. You see, these people pretend to be your friend. They pretend that they care. They pretend to be happy with your success. And yet they're really not. They're not. You see, they follow you on Instagram, or maybe they're your friend on Facebook, but they only do it so they can talk bad about you. And they do it so they can be nosy about your life. So maybe it's time that you take the time to go down your friends list and clean it up a little bit. Maybe it's time you go into your Instagram account and you do a little bit of blocking and some unfollowing of people that you know deep down in your heart don't have your best interests in mind and that are in fact just being jealous and envious towards you. Yeah, what we have to remember here is that despite Saul's evil intentions, David never did anything evil back to King Saul. You see, when Saul lunged that spear at David, trying to pin him to the wall, David didn't use self-defense against King Saul. He could have defended himself at that point, but he didn't. It says he just ran away. He escaped him, not once, but twice. Another interesting point is that David knew he was going to be the future king. Remember in that first story where we talked about where the prophet Samuel came to David's family and he anointed David saying, you're going to be the next king. So David knew already, I'm going to be the next future king. And yet he didn't use that new popularity that he had with the people of Israel to take over the kingdom, even though I think David could have done it successfully. Instead, we see that David stayed humble and he was patient, even when he was taken advantage of by King Saul, even when he was disappointed by King Saul. And so for that, God rewards David by protecting him from Saul's evil plans, and he helped him succeed. Remember, Saul asked for 100 Philistine foreskins in exchange for David to be able to marry his daughter. And what did David do? He didn't just come back with 100. David came back with 200 Philistine foreskins. And so, coming to the end of our lesson to this evening, I have a truth for you that I want to share with you. And here's what it is. It says, even if a jealous person tries to hurt you or try to set you up for failure, or even if they try to get you into trouble, you can be confident that their evil intentions will not succeed against you. As long as God is on your side. Or I think it's better said, as long as God is inside of your heart. And how do I get God inside of me? It's simple, two things: by praying daily and by reading your Bible daily. It's that simple, those two things. How do I get God inside of me and inside of my heart and to be part of my life? By reading your Bible and by praying. Those two things. And it's just as simple as we all know that in order to get in shape or to get physically fit, you have to do two things. All you got to do is what? Have a balanced diet and exercise. That's it. And yet, how many people don't have a balanced diet and don't exercise? And because of that, they're out of shape. How many Americans are out of shape? And I strongly believe that there's a lot of spiritually out of shape believers out there as well. We know we got to pray. We know we got to read our Bible, but we don't do it. We don't. And so here we see that if we read our Bible, if we pray daily, if we allow God into our lives, if we take time out of our busy schedules to listen to messages like this, then we know God can be with us, for us, and protect us even from jealous people and envious people that plan evil against us. And I'd like to conclude with this. The lesson for you today is this: God can help you rise above the jealous eyes in your life. The reality is, for all of you, is that those jealous eyes aren't going anywhere. They're just not. Today's message wasn't about how do I remove the jealous people out of my life. I mentioned that you can unfriend them on Facebook. I mentioned you can block them on your Instagram or unfollow them, but it's not that easy in the real world. If there's someone jealous you work with, guess what? You're gonna be working with them. If you have jealous people at school and you're going to school, guess what? You got to see them in class every day. And so the lesson here isn't how do I get rid of them out of my life? The lesson is this: accept that there are jealous eyes wherever you go, and that those jealous eyes are watching, they're waiting, they're hoping that you'll fail or that you mess up. So the lesson here is that you need to know, to be aware that those jealous eyes might even plan evil against you. But here's the great lesson we take from this story today. As long as God is on your side, as long as God is inside of your heart, you will succeed in every battle you face, just like David did. And you will ultimately rise above that jealous eye in your life. And with that, we conclude today's lesson. I hope that it touches your heart. I hope that it makes you aware, and that I hope you can take this and have the courage to face people that don't have the best interest in your life, and that you can know that you can arise above any evil plan someone might have against you to sabotage you, your character, spread rumors about you, get you in trouble at work, put you down, say mean and negative comments on your stuff. You can know that you can rise above that, not by getting back at them, not by clapping back like they say, not by getting even with them, but by trusting God, by having God inside your heart and knowing that He will protect you and that you will be successful no matter what you do. And with that, I'd like to finish. Thank you so much for joining. I hope you're all doing well. And till next week. Bye-bye.